Okay. Good morning, everyone. And Center for Exceptional Families wishes to thank you for attending today's webinar. And at your convenience, if you will, click on our website at tcfef.org and learn about the services that we can provide for you and your families in the state of Arkansas. And today, I'm very grateful and appreciative to welcome Jared Hogue, the director with the Alternative Learning Environment with the Arkansas Department of Education. He will be our presenter today and presenting the webinar, The Intersection of Special Education and the Alternative Learning Environment. As he presents to us today, you as participants are muted and your videos are turned off. You can type your questions in the chat, and Jared is going to start with his presentation, and then when he concludes, we will review your questions and he will provide answers to those. And hopefully this will all be done between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. And Jared, thank you again for being with us this morning, and you have it from here.
My pleasure, and good morning, everybody. I thank Centers for Exceptional Families for reaching out to me. As I was telling Karen a moment ago, I've done quite a bit of work with you guys, throughout the years, my various capacities, and I have a lot of respect for the work that the organization does. Parent Mentors serve a very vital service in meeting the needs of students with special needs, and so I'm grateful to be here today. Just to give you a little bit of background on myself, as I am pulling up this presentation. So if you give me just 1 second. Okay, Katie, it looks like I don't have screen sharing abilities just yet. But as that's going, I'll just give you a little bit of information about myself. I've worked in education for a little over 20 years now. I got my start as an educational sign language interpreter before realizing I really wanted to be on the other side of the desk, trying to impact as many students as I could. And so I began working both in K-12 as well as post-secondary as an adjunct instructor for a couple of different local universities. And throughout that time, my interest has always been on serving the needs of those students needing special education programming, and especially working with a student population who are deaf and hard of hearing. But I've served the needs throughout my time of students with various disabilities. So I came to the Department of Education in 2014. I worked in our assessment unit as the coordinator for accommodations for both the alternative assessment for the state as well as our statewide assessment before becoming in our special education unit the administrator for dispute resolution, which, as you can imagine, it was a very exciting job, never a dull moment, before taking this position I hold now almost 2 years ago as the director of alternative education. So I'm going to pull this up real quick and see. There we go. So now, Karen, are you all able to see the screen?
Jared, I'm not sure what's going on with me. Let's see.
I can see your screen, Jared.
Okay.
Great. So you do see the title slide?
Yes, it's perfect.
Excellent. Okay. Well, just to get things started, this is going to be talking about the intersection between special education and alternative education, which, I put the crossroads there because, we sometimes think of ALE as a crossroads, and that was the best picture I could find from my favorite movie, which most people think is kind of strange, but my favorite movie is Castaway. And if you're familiar, at the very beginning and at the very end, Tom Hanks' character finds himself standing at the crossroads and trying to decide what he wants to do. And so some people might think of one of those state highways as special education and the other as alternative education. But as is sometimes the case, we find that it looks and feels more like this. So there are many questions that surround the intersection or interchange between special education and alternative education. So in this session, we're going to look briefly at exactly what alternative education is, which is frequently referred to as ALE, or alternative learning environment. I do my best to say alternative education because, like special education, alternative education for me is not a location, just as special education is not a special education room. It's a set of programming for students in need. So alternative education, much the same, even though most people do refer to it as an alternative learning environment, or ALE. So before moving into some scenarios and some frequently asked questions, we're going to take a look at that definition. And I'll go ahead and give you a little bit of a disclaimer here. Please understand that any information that I'm sharing with you comes from the laws, from the rules, from experience and observation. It's not meant to answer any specific individual situation involving actual students, because decisions regarding placement in ALE, just as in special education, are based on student need and are driven by data and are individually based to maximize student needs. So in looking at alternative education, or ALE, we need to have a shared understanding, especially for any traditional classroom teachers or educators who may happen to be with us today. Many people are under the mistaken understanding that ALE is, quote, where the bad kids go. And that is absolutely not true. That is not the purpose of ALE. Sometimes we may find that is what ALE is being used for or thought of in some school districts by some educators. Hopefully not, and we do our best to make sure that that's not the case. Because although there are many students in alternative education who are facing some behavioral challenges, that's not meant to be a punitive environment. In fact, in the state rules which govern alternative education, it's clearly stated ALE is not to be a punitive program or a punitive environment. A student who's placed in ALE is placed there because of the challenges that they face, and those are challenges that create a barrier to learning. We can often more easily understand that a student with a disability who has an IEP or even a 504 plan has specific needs to assist them with their learning goals, but we sometimes have a blurred understanding of a student who has no disability, although some ALE students do. But these are students who still face barriers to learning. So in looking at ALE and the student population that ALE is designed to serve, you will see on the screen, this comes directly from the ALE rules, looking at the student's personal situation. To be an eligible ALE student, a student must exhibit 2 or more of the characteristics shown here. These are characteristics exhibited or situations in which the student finds him or herself that negatively affect academic and social progress. These situations place a student in a frame of mind that's not conducive to learning, either academically or socially, sometimes one or the other, sometimes both. As educators, we try to make ourselves aware of our students' situations. And as a former teacher myself and building administrator, we offer assistance as we're able to, but some of these are things that we can't really offer assistance, where we're not trained to offer assistance in many of these areas. That's when we need special assistance to come in and help us, same as with any special education teacher. But many of these are situations that we're ill-equipped to resolve. So we frequently ask ourselves, what can we do? Well, what we can do is we can remove barriers that exist in our classrooms and in our curriculum, in our procedures, in the way that we set up our classrooms and the way that we teach, that do not reach far enough to engage students facing these situations. So sometimes the barrier is not in the things that you'll see listed here on the screen, but the barrier lies with our approach as educators. So I know that my time spent as a classroom educator, I was what you might call an edutainment teacher. For me, it was more about entertaining the students while still having them learn at the same time, because many students I found in the school districts in which I worked were students who, education was the last thing on their mind. They may be going home and watching little brother, little sister, while single mom is working 2 to 3 jobs to keep food on the table. And so, education is not something that's forefront of their mind. So they need something that gives them that desire, that involvement, that investment in learning. And so I think that if we do the best that we can, and not all teachers are going to teach that way, not everybody is cut out, and that's not to say it was perfect, because oftentimes it wasn't. But it lies with our approach. So as educators, we try to find a way to reach these students and overcome some of these barriers. And as you can see, or these personal situations and characteristics, and as you can see on these, some of these are pretty severe. Others can be a little vague. So I have sometimes said that ALE students, because of the way that the rules are written, because of the design, are meant to give the flexibility so that we can serve those students whose needs are most severe. But in looking at these, many students could qualify as an ALE student. So that's why we have to be very selective in who we place in an educational in ALE education. Educational environment. So the first thing we have to do is consider, when looking at a student who has an IEP or 504, if they're being referred or suggested for alternative education programming, we have to consider why the team is considering the placement in the first place. Sometimes that's because a teacher may feel ill-equipped to deal with certain behavioral aspects of the student because of those characteristics that I mentioned just a moment ago. Other times it's because the student may need a smaller environment. I've been working with a student and with a teacher and with the district superintendent recently. I won't mention the district, but I've been receiving calls from all three of these individuals, and I don't share that information that I'm speaking with the others. So none of them is aware that I'm speaking with all three of them about the situation. And this is a situation where we have a student who does not have an IEP or 504, but has some pretty significant anxiety concerns and finds that a smaller classroom environment is necessary. The parent and the student feel that it's absolutely necessary. So they actually want to be in the alternative learning environment. And many of our students do. Many students do, if it's being used appropriately. Those who feel like it's a punishment, of course, don't. And many parents who look at it that way don't. But it is meant to be a positive thing to assist students. So I wanted to take a moment to share with you all the commonalities between special education and alternative education. If you're not aware, if you are a non-educator, you may not be aware, and some new educators may not be aware, but we try our best to use something that's called high leverage practices. High leverage practices started off as an examination for those 19 key areas in general education that really drive good quality instruction, really reaching students. So not long after those high leverage practices came to the forefront of education, of course, our wonderful special education colleagues decided to look at that and see how can we meet our special education students' needs in much the same way. And so those 19 HLPs actually became 22 HLPs for meeting students' special education needs. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you a link that will allow you to go to this Google slide presentation, and you'll see that these underlined words that you see on the screen are actually links, and I'm not going to take you to them now for the purpose of time management, but you can click on these and see. You will see that first one says that this is a crosswalk document for special education geared HLPs as they appear in general education and special education. This is some work that was done by the Cedar Center, and it's wonderful to see, even if you're wanting to just look at it as a parent or as a teacher of a student receiving special education services. And I will show you that as well. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see that we have something that the National Alternative Educators Association has put out that are called the quality indicators. These quality indicators serve the same purpose as high leverage practices. And when comparing those two documents, which we hope to create a crosswalk document in the near future that shows the similarities, but these quality indicators in alternative education serve the same purpose as those high leverage practices. So you'll start to see that there is a lot of commonality when looking at the programming options offered through alternative education as well as special education. So, for instance, I wanted to share with you a few of the special education high leverage practices. You'll see them there on the left side of your screen. Three of them that I chose to highlight are looking at or establishing a consistent, organized, respectful learning environment, providing positive and constructive feedback, and teaching social behaviors. Over on the right-hand screen, you can see that those ALE quality indicators, which I won't read to you, but I will tell you that they encapsulate those special education HLPs that you see on the left. So you can see that ALE's mission is much the same as the mission that all teachers have in special education in providing a student with a free and appropriate public education to meet their needs. Now, this is something that my team and I work with on a daily basis, working with parents, with educators, with administrators, most especially, in further identifying what alternative education really is. If you start at the bottom of the pyramid, which we refer to this as the RTI pyramid or response to intervention pyramid, if you'll notice the bottom of the pyramid is what we call tier 1 core instruction. This is the classroom instruction that's given to all students, whether it's a student with an IEP. This is the traditional general education and traditional special education approach to quality core instruction. These are classroom rules, classroom procedures, the way that you teach, the curriculum you use, things that are designed to make sure that learning is occurring, that social development is occurring, establishing those rules and procedures which really make that investment clear. If we have a small group of students, which we typically do, around 10 to 15% of students who find themselves struggling for one reason or another in tier 1, then we look at the middle part of the pyramid, more of a targeted intervention in addition to that core instruction for these students that we think of as possibly at risk. So this is your core instruction plus some supplemental intervention. We like to point out that the top 1 to 5% is what we would refer to as tier 3, which means an intensive one-on-one intervention with students. That does not mean one-on-one education. That does not mean a one-on-one paraprofessional to assist a student with an IEP. That is not what it means. It just means that you're looking at more intensive intervention. So to further move up that pyramid from the 1 to 5%, ALE is designed to serve the needs of the top 2 to 3% of students who are facing some behavioral or some academic challenges that are brought about by those 12, a possibility of 2 or more of those 12 criteria that I showed you a moment ago. So ALE really should be no more than 2 to 3% of a school district's population. Now, I was fortunate enough during the most recent LEA Academy conference, which is the conference for special education directors last fall, to hear from Dr. Frances Setson, as everybody was. And she had noted, she wondered, where has tier 1 gone? And when she said that, I thought, wow, that's impactful, because I couldn't agree more. Tier 1 strategies seem in some instances, not all, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but in some instances have fallen by the wayside. So I firmly believe that we have to have more of a focus on tier 1 strategies that would not only enhance special education inclusion, but also ALE inclusion as well. So we got to remember that this graphic is also in use when we consider special education placements, when we're looking at how is this student responding. And I will mention, as I did earlier, that I spent many years working in special education in both the classroom and state level. So I have seen my share of IEP meetings. I've written my share of IEPs. So I'm very much aware of the need to provide an education for a student, a free and appropriate public education that is designed to meet that student's needs to allow for meaningful progress in light of the child's circumstances, to borrow a phrase from Andrew. So this form that I wanted to show you is the ALE referral, because ALE or alternative education programming is not meant to be a unilateral placement by any individual. Much like special education, a student must be referred for alternative education. So this is the referral form that a parent or a teacher or an administrator would fill out. And I wanted to focus here on this bottom section, response to intervention. RTI interventions, like I showed you just a moment ago, should be taking place before a student is even recommended or referred for ALE. There should be things that have gone on in Tier 1 and Tier 2 to try to help this student in meeting his or her goals. So I wanted to take a moment, look at a few frequently asked questions that I receive almost on a daily basis. So can a student with an IEP be placed in an alternative learning environment? I wouldn't be here today if the answer wasn't already obvious. But most of the time I give one of these kind of answers that most people don't like. Yes, they can. However, a student's IEP team should make as many attempts as possible to provide different interventions to assist that student before even considering an ALE placement. It's not the same as what we in special education would refer to as a child find obligation, where if we feel like, oh, this student may have one of the IDEA outlined disabilities, which are causing an impact on their education, and goodness, we need to make sure that we are considering them for assessment to see if they do need an IEP or possibly a 504. But when we're looking at ALE, it's a little bit different. However, in much the same capacity, it is similar in some areas. So the team should have data and documentation of those interventions that guide that decision, that referral, and whether or not they're actually placed in alternative education. So if this is going to be the case with a student with an IEP or with a 504, lots of different interventions should have already been attempted. Most of the time, if this is in response to behavior, there should already be a behavior improvement plan in place or a behavior intervention plan in place to assist that student. I frequently will recommend to educators, if you are recommending that a student be placed in an alternative learning environment because of certain behavioral challenges that they may exhibit, I would hope, and it's not a mandate, but I would hope that you had already gone through what we call a functional behavior assessment or analysis, and that you've already established a behavior intervention plan, that you've already attempted many different avenues to try to meet this student's needs. So another question I get is placing a student in an ALE, an IEP team decision, or is it an ALE referral committee decision? I will sometimes hear from people that IEP or special education is guided by federal law, guided by IDEA. So therefore, every placement decision, every educational decision is an IEP decision, IEP team decision. And so therefore it trumps, to use that word, although I don't like using that word. It's not a matter of one document trumping another document. The IEP is set in place to meet the student's needs. But ALE serves much the same function by establishing a student action plan once a student is placed. So the answer is it an ALE team decision or an IEP team decision as to who's referred? Again, both. However, the IEP team might decide that a student's best placement would be in the ALE. If that's the case, they do still have to follow the same procedures that any other student would. They have to be referred using that document I showed you a moment ago. And ultimately, the decision as to whether or not a student would qualify is left to both committees. So an IEP team might meet and say, we really feel like this student would benefit from the smaller environment, the more focus that is provided in an alternative learning environment. But then they still have to refer that student. They can't just place ALE in the IEP and assume because it's an IEP, they have to do it. That's not the case. It still has to go through ALE to determine the ALE referral team to determine if this student qualifies for ALE and if it's the best placement. Because like I said, some parents and some educators don't want their students in ALE, vehemently don't want them in ALE, while others vehemently do. I've heard many cases where the students' parents really pushed for ALE. I want my child in ALE. So as somebody who is either a parent of a student with an IEP or a special education teacher, you are very familiar with this document, and this is directly from one of the special education documents. This is looking at least restrictive environment considerations. So in looking at the different things that an IEP team needs to determine what the student's least restrictive environment is, you'll see those things that are listed. I won't read them to you, but those are the things that you look at when considering what is a student's least restrictive environment. And then you need to also consider, is this the placement that the child would normally attend if this was a child without a disability? And is this placement closest or as close as possible to the child's home, to the child's home school or home in general? So in looking at one of our ALE documents, we need to understand that if this is an IEP team decision, or ask this question, is it, I hear this question frequently, sorry. Is this the IEP team's decision once the student with an IEP is placed in ALE? Is it the IEP team's decision when to return the student to the traditional classroom? So that decision to return is actually something that's based on the ALE Student Action Plan, or SAP, that transition plan, and the ALE committee. So although an IEP team may meet, because ALE and special education instructors, educators work very closely together. Once a student with an IEP is placed in ALE, they work very closely together to make sure that that student is still receiving a free and appropriate public education, but also to see if the needs of their IEP is being met, if the goals established in their student action plan are being met. The ALE committee makes the determination if the student action plan has been successfully, those goals have been successfully achieved, then they would meet with the IEP team to recommend placement be changed back to the traditional classroom, traditional environment. So you'll see here on the form that you would need to mark after a review of the student's goals when placed. We've made the determination this is what's going to happen, and here's the date on which it will happen. And one thing I mentioned that ALE educators and special education teachers and administrators work together closely throughout the student's time in an alternative learning environment, but also after the transition back to what we call traditional school environment, whether that's general education or special education. The ALE educators work very closely with those traditional school or traditional classroom teachers to make sure that the student is being monitored, to make sure that the things that found it necessary for placement into ALE are working okay. That basically that the interventions that were done in the ALE were successful. Probably the most often question that I get is, ALE is considered a general education setting, so wouldn't it therefore automatically be least restrictive when considering LRE? It's not really that simple. This is a screenshot that comes directly from a Family's Guide to Special Education in Arkansas. This is found on our DESE Special Education website. This is from the 2019 edition. It comes from page 43, and it comes, if you'll notice the citation, 34 CFR, such and such. That means this comes directly from IDEA. And so it states, to the maximum extent appropriate, those kids with disabilities should be served with students who are not disabled. So when considering to the maximum extent possible, I always throw that caveat in there, that the students with an IEP or with a 504 should be served as much as possible with students without a disability. So therefore, is it least restrictive when looking that ALE is a general education environment? Yes and no. Because they are being served with students without a disability, which would seem to satisfy the requirement under IDEA. However, that may not be the case, because if it is a more restrictive environment that you would find, we have to make sure that we're meeting the students' needs. And this all hinges on one very simple but vague and nebulous statement that ALE centers, ALE programming throughout the state of Arkansas appears very different in each district. A larger district might have a separate building, a separate campus where the student is served with multiple classrooms, with multiple ALE educators that are committed only to ALE. Where for a very small school district, their ALE programming may be one classroom with one teacher. Uh, Part of the experience that I had working as a general education teacher for a while was I worked for a very small school district, and my goal as the 7th and 8th grade English teacher for this district, which again, very small, I taught both 7th and 8th grade English teacher. Hope you liked Mr. Hogue because you got him again in 8th grade if you had him for 7th grade. But one of my class periods, I rotated into the ALE center and I taught English to anybody who happened to be in the ALE classroom. That is sometimes something that happens. That's for school districts that are very small. So ALE, I say all this to say ALE looks very different in every district. So that's why placement decisions cannot be made based on an overarching set of rules. They have to be specific to the student. Much the same as special education decisions are made based on what the district can provide, as long as the district makes sure that a free and appropriate public education is being offered. That's going to look very different in the state's largest school district, Springdale, versus the state's smallest school district, Mineral Springs. That's going to look very different between those two. But focusing on student needs is definitely what we need to do. I am going to turn off my email so that those things aren't showing up. Okay, sorry about that. So although ALE might be seen as a general education setting, it is by nature more restrictive. So that's why those decisions have to be student driven to meet that student's needs. So when a student with an IEP or 504 is served, it can be viewed as additional programming for the students, and it really should, ideally. It's not supposed to be punitive by definition, by the mandate in the Arkansas state rules governing ALEs. It really should be viewed as an additional layer of programming for that student. So another question I get, how are IEP services delivered or provided in an ALE? Well, again, because large school districts and small school districts will address ALE very differently in the way that they provide these services. It's just like with special education, it's varied, and so the services will look a little different. However, the simple answer is that those IEP services must be provided by appropriately licensed, and I'm going to read this one to you because it's important, special educators and those related service providers that we see like SLPs and OTPTs. So those, they must be appropriately licensed, but they can be provided either in that ALE environment or elsewhere. Sometimes we see that we have in a larger district dedicated special education professionals who work within the ALE, and that is their job. Other times we will see ALE students in a smaller district possibly, who are sent to the classroom of the special education teacher with other ALE students. So that is a dedicated ALE class period, if you will, for that special education teacher. And in still other cases, the special education teacher, especially in a small district where the class is in the campus building itself, they'll simply walk down the hall and provide those services. But those services are still being provided by a licensed special education or licensed related service provider. We must make sure that data from the IEP is used to help establish that student action plan that the student will have once they're in ALE. We've got to make sure that a student action plan is followed, but that the student's IEP plan definitely is followed when we're looking at the provision of FABE. So both of those things should work in tandem. And I will typically tell people when placing a student with an IEP or a 504 plan within ALE, it's very important that you look at the student's IEP, obviously, but you can look at it to help you guide the establishment of goals, both short-term and long-term goals within the student action plan. Doesn't mean you just copy and paste over, but you can look at those key areas for which the student was recommended or referred for alternative education programming. You would look at those and think, okay, well, these are the key areas that we really need to focus on. That does not mean that they're not still being a key focus of the student's IEP or 504 plan, because they are. Again, it's just an additional layer of programming. So to wrap all this up, alternative education and special ed are both thought of as special programming to meet a student's needs. Placement in one or both varies by the student need, as by the district's capacity or capability to provide it. That doesn't mean that one district will provide it better than others. It just means that they have different resources available, and so again, it may look on the surface different, but in essence, they're still providing those needs, for providing for those needs that the student has. So it's very important to understand that just because it may look a little different, it's still serving those students' needs. So Ms. Karen, do we have any questions?
Participants, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, and I will provide those to Jared. Good information, Jared. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. And as we are waiting for any questions, whether there are any or not, I want to go ahead and switch to this slide. I will tell you, if you're not familiar with using tinyurl.com, you don't have to type in the www. It's just a straight hypertext transfer protocol, HTTP, tinyurl.com/ however, the key here is it must be in the caps that's shown. So TCFEF must be capitalized and must be in lowercase, and ALE must be in caps. But if you'll go to that, you will have viewer rights to this slideshow that I just used.
Mr. Jared, we do have a question, and the request is if you can tell us about ALE during child find after special education referral process has been initiated, specifically for a kindergartner.
Okay, that's a really good question. Once a child has been, and I'm dipping back on my special ed background here. Once a child has been identified through child find, well, let me back up, not identified, suspected of being a child with a disability in need of special education programming, they are technically under the umbrella of IDEA at that point. Whether or not the team determines that they are in need of an IEP or in need of something else that's not special education, they still fall under the IDEA umbrella at that point. So that's where you would want to look very carefully at providing for the needs of that student. What is the best placement? Now, that does not automatically mean that, oh, because we're going through the 60-day process of assessing the student for whether or not that a student might not be placed in ALE. They might be. I will frequently tell school districts, or I always tell school districts, the best thing to do is to work with the parents on this to make sure that we're meeting the students' needs. If you feel as a school district staff that the best place for this student is going to be the ALE center, then please try to make it known to parents, if they are in opposition to this, that you're providing access to a smaller environment. It's not a punitive thing, and it may be something that should be something that helps this student out. So it's best to work with parents on this. I will tell you, one of the things that is sometimes disheartening to parents, especially for those who are very much opposed to their child being placed in an ALE, is their voice is considered under IDEA. The parent has the right to voice their consideration to be a member of that IEP team, to help establish or draft that IEP and those services that are needed for that student. So they are a part of the IEP team. With an ALE, they are also part of the ALE team in helping determine those needs. However, with an ALE referral, the ability to have some recourse after the fact, if they strongly disagree, is a little more limited. There are options available to a parent as to, if they want to pursue this further. They do have many more options that they can consider. With an ALE, placement is, even though the parent is invited, placement is at the discretion of the district. So your recourse as a parent, if you were really opposed to this, would be to go to the building principal, which you likely have already spoken with because they are also a member of the ALE referral committee. But your recourse after that would be to go a little further up, assistant superintendent or superintendent. If you're not finding a favorable result there, to go to the school board and take your complaint there to make that known. But those are the options that are available. And sometimes I will get calls from parents who say, I would like for you to intervene. The state does not have the authority to make any overriding decision on an IEP. For the most part, as long as that IEP is reasonably calculated to ensure for the student to make progress, meaningful progress. But with an ALE, we do not have the authority to step in and make any unilateral decision on that case. So that's why I tell school districts, please work very closely with those parents to make sure that they are aware this is not a punitive thing. And even if it's within that 60-day child find window where we're going through and doing those assessments, make sure that you're making you're with the parent, that you're making the right call to meet the student's needs. The whole thing is, if you will focus solely on the student and what he or she needs, you'll never go wrong.
That's true. Thank you. We have another question, and that is, are IEP behavior plans or the student action plan to be followed?
Both. If a student's behavior plan is part of the student's IEP, it is to be followed. Student action plans, because they are typically drafted after a behavior plan, components of that behavior plan can be incorporated into the student's action plan. Sometimes they may see in the student action plan, when it comes to looking at behavioral goals, there may be just a note that says, see the student's IEP behavior plan. So both. All components of the IEP are to be followed, whether they're in ALE or not. Those components of the IEP are established and must be followed. So that student action plan often mirrors certain aspects or components, because again, the IEP is designed to provide for the education, not just academics, but looking at social and developmental things as well. So the education as a whole. The student action plan in the ALE is designed to do exactly the same thing. So we're looking at the student's needs as a whole. So the IEP must be followed.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from participants?
Hopefully everybody's had a chance to have a look at this. I will share one final slide here. And this is my team. So we are the alternative education unit here at the state. I need to change that because that's a little old. Deborah Bales has recently become Deborah Basinger. So I will get that changed if you are looking at the slideshow here, sometime later. You'll see that her email address, her phone number is not changed, but her email address will be reflected of her new name. And then Dr. C.W. Gardenhire is also one of my program advisors. And then myself, of course. I will tell you, in the alternative education unit, things are a little different than they are in some other units, in the fact that in addition to serving as the director for the unit, I also am the direct point of contact for a third of the state. So we'll tell you, if you are in the north central, northeast, or south central areas, Deborah Basinger will be your contact. If you are in the central part of the state, it's either going to be Dr. Gardenhire or myself, but Dr. Gardenhire also covers the Delta region all the way down southeast. And then I cover everything on the western side of the state, from northwest Arkansas down western Arkansas and into southwest. So Texarkana to Pea Ridge, that's all me. But I'm happy to work with anybody from any district because that's part of my job as well. So you can call me up for for any situation, no matter where your school district is. But I may refer you at that point to either Ms. Basinger or Dr. Gardenhire to assist, because they both have a lot of experience. Both of them have worked in this ALE unit for over 10 years. Well, actually, I think Deborah has been 9 years, but Dr. Gardenhire is 12 or 13 years. They know these school programs inside and out.
Jared, I do have another question, and that is, what if a district does not have an ALE program and the team feels a private developed center K through 12 is more appropriate?
All school districts are required to offer ALE programming. It's going to look different. As I said, some school districts, most school districts provide it in-house on their own, but other school districts, especially smaller school districts, can take advantage of the rules ability to allow them to work with other small school districts to come together as a consortium. So there are many small school districts who will work if they are 2 or 3 districts, and one of those districts happens to be larger than the others. Many times they'll work together and send those services to the larger school district. Others, there are a couple of different educational co-ops in the state which offer services, possibly at a different center, possibly at the classroom, but they are the ones who are contracted to provide those services. Now, that does not take away from the district's responsibility to provide FAPE. The district is responsible for making sure that those IEPs are carried out and that those needs are met. But all school districts provide for ALE programming.
And another question. So ALEs are for all grade levels, K through 12?
Another good question. Different school districts, because the rules are kind of vague in that, and they say that they must offer ALE programming. Some school districts do provide for K-12 for ALE. Others only do it at the secondary. Some only do it at the lower levels. So it really just varies by school district. We have some school districts that may offer programming through 6 different ALE or 7 different ALE programs. And then we have others that only have one, and it may only serve 9th through 12th. It really just depends on meeting those needs. Now, I typically will tell parents and educators within very small school districts that if their ALE program is only serving grades 9 through 12, that shouldn't be a concern, because if you have a student in a lower grade level who is in need, your belief is they're in need of ALE programming, they are such a small school district that they have a smaller environment. They should be able to meet those student needs in tier 1 and tier 2.
Thank you for those questions. Thank you for those answers. Do we have any other questions? Just a few more minutes.
Now, we'll tell you as we're waiting to just kind of expound on that a little bit. School districts go through a 3-year renewal process when it comes to alternative education. School districts belong to a cohort, either cohort 1, 2, or 3 with us, and every 3 years or sooner, if they've made significant changes or added an additional program, a new program. But every 3 years, they're required to submit what we call a program description submission form. So what we do is we go through and we look at certain key aspects of the program. It's very detailed to make sure that that program meets the guidelines of the state. And so every 3 years, they have to go through a renewal process. So when looking at monitoring of school districts and their programs, that is one form of monitoring that we do, where we work very closely with the school districts at least every 3 years to make sure that their programs are established in a way that meets the needs. Now, that sounds like, well, gosh, every 3 years, but that's not to say that that's the only time we work with them. We make phone calls to these school districts many times. So just because their program may not require the new form for submission and approval, but once every 3 years, we still are working with them, providing technical assistance throughout the school year.
Jared, and my apology. In regards to that last question, ALEs for all grade levels K through 12, they came back and asked, but an elementary student should not be in with a secondary student.
Oh, most definitely. So and I appreciate that clarification. Um, Students should be served in the same grade band. And that goes to when we're working with a school district. If they have submitted, we want to have programming for grades 6 through 12. And we say, okay, how are you going to break that up? Because we have roughly 250, 260 school districts in the state. We have around 500 ALE programs because districts will sometimes offer more programs than just that one. If they're serving different grade bands, they may be serving grades K through 2, 3 through 5, or 3 through 6, and then 7 through 9, and then 10 through 12. They may have various grade bands, but no, we very closely monitor that. School districts are not to place kindergartners in with 12th graders. They are to be placed according to their grade band as close as possible to that grade level. I would not want to see a student in kindergarten in with a significantly older student, just as I wouldn't want to see a middle school student in a classroom with a significantly older student. Their more targeted educational approach, it necessitates that they are with students that are closer to their own age.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you. If there aren't any more questions, again, I wish to thank you, Jared, for your time and your collaboration and working with the Center for Exceptional Families and presenting today's webinar, the intersection between special education and the alternative learning environment.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Definitely. The webinar has been recorded, and it is my understanding that it will eventually be available per the Center for Exceptional Families website at tcfef.org. And again, I encourage you to visit our website and learn more about how we, the parent mentors and our director, Shelby Knight, can be of service to the parents and professionals in the educational route for their children and their families here in the state of Arkansas. If that's it, I guess we'll be ending today. And thank you so much for participating. And also check out our website to find out upcoming webinars and/or visit our Facebook page. You can also get that information there. That's it. I'm going to end this session